In the spring of 1945, a ruined capital became the final altar of the war in Europe. Millions of soldiers closed in from the east, while a collapsing regime demanded sacrifice to the last man, the last child, and the last street. Berlin was no longer a city. It was a battlefield where an empire died, and a continent's future was sealed. By early 1945, Nazi Germany stood on the edge of annihilation. In the east, the Red Army had shattered the Wehrmacht through a succession of vast offensives that began after the failure of Germany's last great armoured effort at Kursk. From that moment, the initiative in the east was lost forever. Throughout 1944, Soviet forces advanced relentlessly. Army Group Center was destroyed during Operation Bagration. Minsk was retaken. German divisions were annihilated in numbers greater than those lost at Stalingrad. By the autumn, Soviet armies stood on the Vistula River, while German forces clung desperately to defensive lines across Eastern Europe. In the west, Allied landings in Normandy forced Germany into a war on two fronts. Although the Wehrmacht launched a final gamble in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge drained its remaining armoured reserves and achieved nothing of lasting value. When the offensive collapsed, Germany no longer possessed the strength to resist. Simultaneously in East and West, by the end of 1944, Soviet forces had expelled the Germans from Soviet territory entirely. Axis allies fell away one by one. Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary were lost. Budapest was encircled. The Red Army redeployed for one final blow. For Joseph Stalin, Berlin was the supreme prize. The capture of the German capital would symbolize absolute victory and ensure Soviet dominance over Central and Eastern Europe. Distrustful of the Western Allies, Stalin was determined that the Red Army would reach Berlin first, regardless of cost. In preparation for the final offensive, Stalin assembled the greatest concentration of military power in history. More than 2 million men, tens of thousands of artillery pieces, thousands of tanks, and overwhelming air power were brought forward. Two principal Soviet commanders were chosen for the final drive. Marshal Georgy Zhukov would advance from the east, while Marshal Ivan Konev would strike from the south. Stalin deliberately encouraged rivalry between them, turning the advance on Berlin into a race. Opposing them was a German army in collapse. Hitler's paranoia following the failed assassination attempt of July 1944 had destroyed any remaining trust between himself and his generals. He issued rigid orders forbidding withdrawal and dismissed commanders who showed initiative. By early 1945, German defenses relied on fixed lines, improvised units, and a mixture of exhausted veterans, conscripts, old men, and dead teenage boys. The German defensive system east of Berlin was extensive on paper but hollow in reality. Multiple defensive belts were constructed along the Oder River, supported by fortified towns and anti-tank obstacles. Yet shortages of fuel, ammunition, and trained manpower undermined any hope of sustained resistance. On April 16, 1945, the long-awaited final offensive began. For nearly 4 years, the war in the East had advanced and retreated across forests, rivers, and shattered cities. Now it reached its decisive moment. In the grey half-light before sunrise, silence hung briefly over the front, heavy with anticipation. Soldiers waited in trenches and gun pits. Commanders studied maps already worn thin by constant handling, and the last preparations were made for an assault that would decide the fate of Germany and the future of Europe. At dawn, the stillness, was broken by sound on a scale never before experienced. Soviet artillery opened fire in a coordinated barrage of unprecedented intensity. Along the Oder and Neisse rivers, thousands of guns spoke at once. Field pieces, heavy howitzers, rocket launchers, and mortar unleashed a continuous storm of steel. The first shells struck the German positions with blinding flashes, followed by waves of concussions that rolled across the landscape. The ground trembled as if shaken by a vast and relentless force of nature. Millions of shells fell within a matter of hours. Entire stretches of forest were shredded into splinters. Defensive lines that had taken months to prepare were crushed into the soil. Trenches collapsed, bunkers cracked, and communication lines vanished under explosions and debris. The air itself seemed to burn as smoke, dust, and fire merged into a single choking cloud. For those caught beneath the barrage, time lost its meaning. Each second blended into the next, amid the roar, the shock, and the fear. The bombardment along the Oder-Neisse line was not merely an opening attack. It was a deliberate act of overwhelming force, intended to break resistance before the infantry and armor advanced. Soviet planners understood that this was the last great barrier before Berlin. Beyond these rivers lay the road to the German capital, and beyond that, the end of the war in Europe. Nothing was to be left to chance. The artillery fire was calculated, layered, and sustained, striking known strong points while saturating entire zones to deny the defenders any sense of safety. As the barrage continued, searchlights mounted behind the Soviet lines were switched on, their beams cutting through the smoke and low clouds. The intention was to blind the defenders and illuminate the battlefield for the advancing troops. Instead, the reflected light created an eerie glow, turning the haze into a shifting wall of pale brightness. Soldiers later recalled that the scene felt unreal, as if the night itself had been torn open by artificial dawn. For the German defenders, the bombardment marked the beginning of the end. Many units were already exhausted, under strength, and short of supplies. They had fought retreating battles for months, losing ground step by step. Now they faced an enemy that outnumbered them in men, guns, and machines. Some attempted to return fire, but their guns were quickly silenced. Others huddled in what cover they could find, waiting for the shelling to lift and knowing that what followed would be even worse. Far to the west, inside Berlin itself, the sound of the guns carried. Across the countryside, it arrived as a low, distant thunder, steady and unmistakable. For civilians who had endured years of air raids, shortages, and propaganda promises of final victory, this sound carried a different meaning. It was not the passing storm of another bombing raid. It was continuous, methodical, and growing stronger. With each passing hour, many understood, without needing official confirmation, that the war had come home at last. In basements and shelters, people listened in silence. Some counted the seconds between the distant rumbles, trying to guess how far away the fighting was. Others simply stared at the walls, their thoughts heavy with fear and resignation. The city had been declared a fortress, but few believed such words anymore. Refugees from the east had brought stories of destruction and defeat. The thunder from the Oder-Neisse line confirmed what those stories had already suggested. The final reckoning was approaching, for the Soviet soldiers advancing behind the artillery. The bombardment was both reassurance and warning. It promised that the enemy ahead had been shaken, but it also signaled the scale of the battle still to come. Many had marched and fought from the banks of the Volga to the heart of Germany. They carried memories of burned villages, fallen comrades, and years of relentless combat. This offensive was not only a military operation, it was the culmination of sacrifice and endurance on a vast human scale. When the guns finally began to lift their fire, the landscape ahead was scarcely recognizable. Where fields and villages had stood, there was now a churned expanse of craters and wreckage. Smoke drifted in thick layers, and fires burned unchecked. The silence that followed, broken only by smaller explosions and the crackle of flames, felt unnatural after such sustained violence. It was the brief pause before movement resumed. That morning marked a turning point that could not be reversed. The assault on the Oder-Neisse line opened the gateway to Berlin and sealed the fate of the German state. The thunder heard in the capital was more than the sound of artillery. It was the audible signal of collapse, the final chapter of a war that had consumed an entire continent. On April 16th, 1945, history moved with unstoppable force, and those who heard the guns knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Marshal Georgy Zhukov committed his forces against the Seelow Heights, a low ridge of ground that rose gently east of Berlin yet carried immense strategic weight. Though modest in elevation, these heights formed the last natural defensive barrier protecting the German capital from a direct eastern assault. Whoever controlled them controlled the main approach roads, the surrounding floodplains, and the final shield before the city itself. For the Soviet command, breaking through Seelow was essential. For the German defenders, holding it offered the final opportunity to delay the inevitable. The attack unfolded under conditions that quickly undermined even the most detailed planning. The landscape before the heights had been deliberately flooded. By opening dams along the Oder River, turning fields into marshland. As Soviet infantry and armor advanced, vehicles bogged down in deep mud, and movement slowed to a crawl. Smoke from the artillery barrage still hung low over the battlefield, reducing visibility and compounding confusion. Units lost direction. Officers struggled to maintain control, and communication lines were repeatedly severed by shellfire. Despite the overwhelming firepower brought to bear, the initial Soviet advance failed to achieve a clean breakthrough. The sheer density of troops and equipment created congestion on narrow approaches, while the ground itself refused to cooperate. Tanks slipped into craters filled with water and debris. Infantry were forced to advance on foot through open ground swept by a defensive fire. What had been planned as a rapid penetration turned instead into a grinding struggle measured in meters. Gained and lives lost. The German defense, under the command of General Gotthard Heinrici, proved far more resilient than Soviet planners had anticipated. Heinrici was known for his keen understanding of defensive warfare and his ability to read enemy intentions. Anticipating the massive artillery bombardment, he ordered his forward units to withdraw from their most exposed positions shortly before the Soviet guns opened fire. When the shells fell, they smashed empty trenches and shattered abandoned strongpoints, achieving destruction but inflicting fewer casualties than expected. As the Soviet artillery fire lifted and the assault troops moved forward, they encountered defenders who were still intact and ready to fight. German units reoccupied prepared positions on the slopes and reverse sides of the heights, where they enjoyed better cover in clear fields of fire. Machine guns, anti-tank weapons, and artillery began to take a heavy toll on the advancing forces. The defenders exploited every fold in the terrain, every surviving bunker, and every moment of confusion among the attackers. Soviet losses mounted rapidly. Entire assault waves were cut down as they advanced through exposed ground. Medics struggled to reach the wounded under continuous fire. Commanders, under pressure to maintain momentum, committed reserve units into the same killing zones, hoping weight of numbers would succeed where precision had failed. Instead, casualties continued to rise, and progress remained painfully slow. The battlefield itself became a scene of chaos. Smoke and dust obscured landmarks, making coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery increasingly difficult. Orders were delayed or misunderstood. Units advanced without support or halted while waiting for instructions that never arrived. The noise of battle drowned out shouted commands, and the churned ground made rapid movement impossible. What was meant to be a decisive blow began to resemble a brutal war of attrition. For the German soldiers holding the Seelow Heights, the fighting was desperate but purposeful. They knew that they could not win the war, yet every hour gained was an hour. Closer to the arrival of Western Allied forces from the other direction, many believed that delay alone might alter their fate. This belief, combined with Heinrich's disciplined defensive preparations, sustained resistance even as Soviet pressure intensified. Zhukov, observing the slow progress and rising losses, faced a grim decision. The timetable for the capture of Berlin was tight, shaped not only by military necessity but also by political urgency. Rival Soviet fronts were advancing from other directions, and prestige was at stake. Reluctantly, Zhukov ordered additional formations into the battle, increasing pressure on the already congested approaches. The result was an even denser concentration of men and machines under fire. As day followed day, the Seelow Heights absorbed an astonishing volume of violence. Artillery duels raged continuously. Night brought little relief, as flares and gunfire kept the battlefield lit and deadly. The ground became saturated with water, blood, and debris. Each gain was contested. Fiercely, each position taken at high cost. The defenders, though increasingly outnumbered, continued to withdraw in disciplined steps, trading space for time. Within Berlin, reports of the fighting filtered through official channels and rumor alike. The city's leaders spoke of heroic defense and promised that the heights would hold. Yet the distant rumble of battle grew louder, and the flow of wounded and retreating units told a different story. Civilians sensed that the shield was cracking, even if it had not yet collapsed. Ultimately, the struggle for the Seelow Heights revealed the limits of sheer firepower when confronted by skillful defense and unforgiving terrain. The Soviet forces would prevail through persistence, numbers, and sacrifice, but the cost was far higher than anticipated. The delay disrupted plans and exacted a heavy human price, leaving fields littered with wreckage and lives cut short. The Seelow Heights did not stop the Red Army, but they forced it to pay dearly for every step forward, in mud, smoke, and chaos. The final road to Berlin proved far more costly than expected. The battle there stood as a stark reminder that even in the final days of the war, victory was never simple, and the last barriers were often the bloodiest to overcome. Meanwhile, to the south of the Seelow Heights, events unfolded in a sharply different manner. Marshal Ivan Konev launched his offensive with a precision and momentum that contrasted strongly with the brutal stalemate facing Zhukov. his forces struck along a broader front, where German defences were thinner, less elevated, and already strained by shortages of men and material. From the opening hours, the attack demonstrated a flexibility and speed that would soon alter the balance of the entire campaign. Konev employed massive concentrations of artillery, rivaling those used farther north, but he paired this firepower with careful coordination and deception. As the guns opened fire, dense smoke screens were laid across the battlefield, concealing troop movements and masking the true direction of the main thrust. The smoke drifted across rivers, roads, and defensive lines, blinding German observers, and disrupting their ability to direct counterfire. Under this artificial cover, Soviet assault units crossed open ground with reduced exposure, maintaining cohesion as they advanced. The German defences in the south, already weakened by earlier withdrawals and constant pressure, struggled to respond effectually. Many units were under strength, composed of exhausted veterans mixed with hastily assembled formations. Communication failures were frequent, and reserves were scarce. When Soviet artillery smashed command posts and severed telephone lines, local commanders were often left to act on their own initiative, without a clear understanding of the wider situation. As Soviet infantry and armor pressed forward, gaps opened in the defensive line that could not be sealed in time. Once the initial breakthrough was achieved, Konev moved quickly to exploit it. Tank armies were committed without delay, surging through the ruptured German positions and driving deep into the rear areas. Roads clogged with retreating units, refugees, and supply columns became scenes of chaos. German attempts to form new defensive lines collapsed under the speed of the advance. Each hour that passed widened the breach and carried Soviet forces closer to Berlin. Unlike the grinding battle at Seelow, the southern advance unfolded with a sense of relentless forward motion. Soviet commanders emphasized tempo, keeping pressure on the enemy and denying them the time needed to reorganize. Artillery continued to leapfrog forward, supporting the advance at close range. Air support struck retreat routes and crossroads, further paralyzing German movement. The battlefield became fluid, with positions changing hands rapidly and the front line losing its former clarity. At the highest level, these developments did not go unnoticed. Joseph Stalin followed the progress of both offensives with intense interest, receiving frequent reports and updates. From the outset, he had encouraged competition among his senior commanders, believing that rivalry would drive them to greater effort. Now the contrast between the stalled struggle in the north and the rapid gains in the south sharpened that competition dramatically. As Konev's forces pushed closer to Berlin, the question arose of how far they would be allowed to go. The original plan had assigned the capture of the city primarily to Zhukov, whose front faced the capital directly. Konev's role had been to secure the southern approaches and prevent any German breakout or escape. But success on the battlefield has a way of reshaping plans, and Konev's advance created a new reality that could not be ignored. Stalin, observing the unfolding situation, made a decisive choice. He authorized Konev to turn his tank armies northward, toward Berlin itself. With this order, the campaign entered a new and more dangerous phase. Two powerful Soviet fronts were now converging on the same objective, their commanders driven not only by duty but by ambition and prestige. The race for Berlin was no longer theoretical. It was underway in earnest. For Konev's tank crews, The new directive meant an urgent change of direction and purpose. Engines roared as columns pivoted toward the capital, pushing day and night, with minimal rest. Crews slept beside their vehicles, when they slept at all. Fuel and ammunition were rushed forward to sustain the pace. Every kilometer gained brought them closer to the heart of the collapsing German state, and closer to direct contact with Zhukov's forces advancing from the east. The German High Command, already overwhelmed, found the situation increasingly impossible to control. Reports spoke of Soviet armor appearing where none had been expected, cutting off routes of retreat and threatening encirclement. Units that might have reinforced Berlin were instead forced to fight for survival in the open countryside. The southern approach to the city, once considered less critical, now became a corridor of advance that could not be sealed. Within Berlin, the implications were grave. The prospect of multiple Soviet forces converging on the city meant that any remaining hope of organized defense was rapidly fading. The sense of encirclement grew stronger with each passing hour. The thunder of artillery was now joined by the nearer sounds of combat to the south, confirming that the noose was tightening. For Stalin, the decision to unleash Konев toward Berlin served several purposes. Militarily, it increased pressure on the defenders and reduced the chance of prolonged resistance. Politically, it ensured that the capture of the city would be swift and undeniable. Personally, it reinforced his control over his commanders by keeping them in competition, each striving to deliver decisive results. As Konev's forces advanced, the race between the Soviet commanders intensified. Speed became paramount. Orders emphasized urgency, initiative, and relentless movement. There was little concern for rest or recovery. The war had entered its final phase, and the prize now lay within reach. The contrast between the stalled slaughter at Silo and the rapid southern breakthrough underscored a harsh truth of warfare. Success often depended not only on strength, but on timing, terrain, and the ability to adapt. Meanwhile, the road to Berlin narrowed under the weight of converging armies. From the south, Konev drove forward with mounting confidence. From the east, Zhukov continued to force his way through resistance at enormous cost. Between them lay the doomed capital, already trembling under distant bombardment and the knowledge that its fate was sealed. The race was on, and history was moving toward its violent conclusion. Inside the city, preparations for defense slipped steadily from determination into desperation. Berlin, once the carefully planned capital of a regime that claimed order and control, now braced for a battle it could neither win nor truly sustain. As Soviet forces closed in from multiple directions, the city was hastily reorganized into self-defending sectors, each expected to hold out independently if cut off. Streets, parks, and public squares were transformed into improvised fortresses, while normal civic life disappeared almost overnight. The division of Berlin into defensive sectors reflected both necessity and chaos, with communications unreliable and command authority increasingly fragmented. Local commanders were instructed to defend their assigned areas to the last. Responsibility for entire neighborhoods fell to officers with limited resources and little hope of reinforcement. Barricades made from rubble, tramcars, and overturned vehicles blocked major roads. Cellars were converted into command posts, aid stations, and ammunition dumps. Every building became a potential strongpoint, every intersection a potential battlefield. Towering above this improvised defense were the massive concrete flak towers that dominated the skyline. Built earlier in the war to protect the city from air attack, these enormous structures now served as symbols of grim resolve. Their thick walls could withstand heavy bombardment, and their platforms mounted large-caliber anti-aircraft guns that could also be fired horizontally against ground targets. From their heights, defenders could observe wide swaths of the city, directing fire and maintaining a sense of control amid the encroaching collapse. To civilians sheltering inside them, the flak towers offered a rare illusion of safety in a city increasingly exposed to destruction. Yet even these concrete giants could not disguise the deeper weakness of Berlin's defense. The regular army units assigned to the city were few, under strength, and exhausted from months of retreat. To fill the gaps, the regime turned to the Volkssturm, a militia formed from civilians between the ages of 16 and 60. Shopkeepers, clerks, factory workers, and elderly veterans were summoned with little training and minimal preparation. Many were issued old rifles, a handful of rounds, or weapons taken from storage that had not been properly maintained for years. For many Volkssturm members, the reality of combat was terrifying. They were expected to face seasoned Soviet troops supported by tanks and artillery, often with little more than armbands identifying them as fighters. Improvised weapons were common, including crude anti-tank devices that required the user to approach dangerously close to armored vehicles. Instructions were brief and often contradictory. Morale varied sharply, shaped by fear, resignation, or a sense of obligation to family and neighborhood, rather than belief in victory. Alongside the Volkssturm units of the Hitler Youth were drawn directly into the fighting. Boys scarcely out of childhood were issued anti-tank launchers and basic infantry weapons, then sent to the front lines of the city's defense. Many had been raised on years of ideological training and were taught that sacrifice for the state was the highest virtue. Some fought with fierce determination, ambushing tanks from rubble piles and ruined buildings. Others froze under fire, overwhelmed by the noise, violence, and finality of real combat. The use of these young fighters underscored how far the situation had deteriorated. The city's leadership spoke of heroic resistance and final victory, but their actions betrayed an understanding that trained forces were no longer sufficient. Every available body was pressed into service. Schools were closed, factories ceased meaningful production, and public transportation barely functioned. Berlin became a city organized almost entirely around survival and defense. Civilians caught in the middle endured extreme hardship. Food supplies were scarce, water systems damaged, and electricity unreliable. Families crowded into basements. As shelling drew closer, listening to the rumble of artillery and the crack of small arms echoing through the streets, the defensive preparations brought fighting directly into residential areas, turning homes into battlegrounds. Walls were breached to allow movement between buildings, stairwells were fortified, and windows were bricked up or used as firing positions. As Soviet artillery began to strike the outskirts and then the inner districts, the limits of Berlin's defenses became painfully clear. Barricades crumbled under direct fire. Improvised positions offered little protection against heavy weapons. The flak towers continued to fire, defiant and imposing, but they could not stop the steady advance through the streets below. Each sector fought largely alone, isolated by rubble and destruction. The atmosphere within the city grew increasingly surreal. Official broadcasts urged resistance, while reality contradicted every promise. Orders arrived, demanding counterattacks that could not be mounted. Messengers moved on foot through shattered streets because radios no longer worked. Rumors spread faster than facts, and hope narrowed to personal survival rather than national victory. Berlin's preparations for defense, vast in effort yet hollow, in substance, revealed the final bankruptcy of the regime, the mobilization of children and civilians, the reliance on concrete towers and rubble barricades, and the fragmentation of command all pointed to a state fighting not for triumph, but for delay. Each hour gained was an hour before surrender or destruction, nothing more. As the Red Army tightened its grip, the city stood as a stark image of collapse. What had once been presented as an impregnable capital was now a patchwork of desperate strongpoints defended by the old, the young, and the untrained. The preparations inside Berlin did not signal resilience so much as exhaustion. They marked the last, tragic stage of a war that had consumed everything, leaving only ruin, fear, and the approaching certainty of defeat. Among the defenders drawn into the final battle were foreign volunteers of the Waffen formations of the Schutzstaffel, men who had come to Germany from across occupied and allied Europe. Scandinavians, Frenchmen, and others fought in the ruins of Berlin alongside regular German units and local militias. Their presence reflected both the ideological reach of the regime and the depth of its desperation. These men were not defending their own cities or families. They were fighting for a cause that was already collapsing, fully aware that defeat would leave them with no protection and little mercy. Many of these foreign volunteers had joined years earlier, motivated by anti-Bolshevik conviction, nationalism, personal ambition, or the promise of belonging to an elite force. Some believed they were defending Europe itself against Soviet expansion. Others had been swept up by propaganda or saw service as an escape from political or social constraints at home. By the spring of 1945, such motivations mattered less than simple survival. The ideals that had drawn them east had been burned away by years of brutal warfare. In Berlin, these foreign units were often among the most determined defenders. They understood their situation clearly. Capture by the Red Army would not mean treatment as ordinary prisoners of war. Many expected immediate execution or long imprisonment in labor camps. For French volunteers in particular, survival after capture also meant facing prosecution as traitors if they were ever returned home. Scandinavian fighters carried similar fears. This knowledge hardened their resolve and stripped away any remaining hesitation. For them, surrender was rarely considered an option. The regime exploited this desperation. Foreign volunteers were deployed to some of the most dangerous sectors where fighting was fiercest and losses were heaviest. Their commanders emphasized loyalty and sacrifice, reinforcing the belief that there was no path backward. In the shattered streets, these units fought with grim intensity, mounting counterattacks against Soviet spearheads and defending strong points long after hope of relief had vanished. Their resistance slowed advances in certain areas, but it could not change the overall outcome. Inside the city, discipline was enforced through fear rather than confidence. As the military situation deteriorated, terror became a primary tool of control. The leadership understood that belief in victory was gone, and so obedience had to be extracted by force. Orders were explicit. Retreat without authorization was punishable by death. Failure to hold a position, regardless of circumstances, was treated as betrayal. Deserters were hunted relentlessly. Military police and special detachments operated behind the front lines, searching for anyone attempting to flee the fighting. Those caught were often subjected to summary judgment. Public executions became a deliberate spectacle. Bodies were hanged from lampposts, trees, or improvised gallows, sometimes with signs declaring the crime. These scenes were staged not only to punish the individual, but to send a message to all who pass by. Often, such executions took place in full view of civilians. Refugees moving through the streets, families searching for shelter, and the wounded being carried to aid stations were forced to witness these acts. The intention was clear. Fear was to replace loyalty, and terror was to compel continued resistance. The regime no longer relied on persuasion. It relied on intimidation and violence directed inward, against its own people and those fighting in its name. For many soldiers, especially older men and youths pressed into service, the effect was paralyzing. Some fought on out of fear of what would happen if they withdrew. Others sought to disappear into the chaos of the ruined city, discarding uniforms and weapons in the hope of blending into the civilian population. This, too, carried grave risk. The lines between soldier and civilian were increasingly blurred, and suspicion was everywhere. Foreign volunteers of the Schutzstaffel formations were often placed in a different psychological category. Their fear ran in a single direction. They expected death if captured by the enemy, and they expected death if they disobeyed orders. This narrowed their choices and reinforced a brutal clarity of purpose. Many fought with a sense of fatalism, convinced that they were already condemned. In such a mindset, survival through victory became the only imaginable outcome. No matter how unrealistic, the enforcement of discipline through terror revealed the internal collapse of authority. A confident army does not need public hangings to maintain order. The widespread use of such measures showed that cohesion had fractured and morale had eroded beyond repair. Commanders no longer trusted their troops to hold out voluntarily. They relied instead on fear to delay the inevitable. For a few more hours or days dot within the ruined neighborhoods, these acts deepened the suffering of civilians. People already traumatized by bombardment and deprivation were forced to confront the spectacle of violence carried out by their own defenders. The city became a place where danger came from every direction, from advancing armies and from those claiming to protect it. Trust vanished. Survival became a solitary concern. As Soviet forces closed in, the presence of foreign volunteers and the use of terror discipline did little to alter the strategic reality. They could not replace lost divisions or compensate for the overwhelming superiority of the attackers. At best, they prolonged resistance in isolated pockets. At worst, they added to the toll of suffering in a city already condemned. In the final days, Berlin became a convergence of desperation. Foreign fighters battled for a cause that was finished. German civilians endured terror from both sides. Authority asserted itself through fear rather than legitimacy. The public executions, the uncompromising resistance, and the willingness to sacrifice anyone still standing all pointed to the same truth. This was not defense aimed at victory. It was resistance driven by dread of defeat and the knowledge that the end, when it came, would be merciless. The foreign volunteers of the Waffen formations fought on because they believed there was no alternative. The regime enforced obedience because it could no longer inspire it. Together, these elements formed a final, grim chapter of the battle for Berlin, one marked not by hope or strategy, but by fear, inevitability, and the slow collapse of all remaining restraints. As Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, the character of the fighting changed completely. What had once been a battle of fronts and lines dissolved into a savage struggle, block by block, room by room, and floor by floor. The city itself became the battlefield, and the distinction between civilian space and military ground vanished almost overnight. Streets that had carried trams and pedestrians were transformed into killing zones. Courtyards, stairwells, and basements became positions to be seized, defended, and lost again within hours. Every building became a fortress. Apartment blocks, offices, schools, and factories were stripped of any remaining civilian purpose and reshaped for combat. Windows were knocked out to create firing points. Walls were breached so defenders could move between structures without exposing themselves to open streets. Furniture, rubble, and sandbags were piled into makeshift barricades. Even ruined buildings, already shattered by bombing, were used as strong points, their broken walls and collapsed floors offering cover and concealment. Soviet infantry advanced cautiously, knowing that danger could come from any direction. A single building might house defenders on multiple levels, with machine guns firing from upper floors, rifles from stairwells, and explosives thrown from cellars. Clearing such positions required patience and brutality. Assault groups moved forward in small units, using grenades, automatic weapons, and flamethrowers to force defenders out. Progress was measured not in kilometers, but in meters, often paid for with heavy casualties. Tanks operated at point-blank range, their massive guns trained not on distant targets, but on windows, doorways, and entire facades. Armor rolled forward slowly, vulnerable to attacks from above and behind. Crews fired directly into buildings suspected of harboring resistance, collapsing walls and floors with single shots. In narrow streets, tanks were hemmed in by rubble, forced to advance under constant threat from handheld anti-armor weapons. Many were destroyed at close quarters, their hulks left burning as grim landmarks amid the ruins. Artillery was brought forward into the city itself, firing over open sights at close targets. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble as guns pounded defensive positions relentlessly. Blocks that resisted too long were systematically smashed until nothing remained but broken masonry and smoke. Fires spread unchecked, fed by shattered gas lines and wooden interiors. The skyline was darkened by thick columns of smoke that turned day into twilight and night into an orange glow. The noise of battle was overwhelming. The thunder of artillery, the crash of collapsing buildings, the crack of small arms, and the roar of engines merged into a continuous wall of sound. Orders were shouted at close range or passed by hand signals, as radios often failed amid the destruction. Dust and smoke filled the air, choking soldiers and blinding them at critical moments. Visibility was often limited to a few meters, making every corner a potential ambush. For the defenders, the fighting was desperate and unforgiving. Cut off from reliable communication and reinforcement, small groups held isolated positions for as long as ammunition lasted. Some fought on until their buildings were destroyed around them. Others attempted sudden counterattacks through rubble-filled alleys, hoping to surprise advancing troops. There was little coordination beyond the immediate surroundings. Each existed in its own shrinking world of fear, exhaustion, and resolve. Civilians were trapped in the middle of this destruction. Families hid in cellars and basements as the city burned above them. These underground spaces, never designed for prolonged shelter, became crowded refuges filled with smoke, dust, and the stench of fear. Food and water was scarce. Many had not seen daylight for days. Every explosion overhead sent debris raining down and raised the fear that the building would collapse. Entirely, the sounds of the battle penetrated even the deepest shelters. Walls shook with each nearby impact. Plaster and brick dust drifted from ceilings. Children cried, the elderly prayed, and others sat in silence, conserving what little strength they had left. Venturing outside to search for water or food was a gamble with death. Streets were swept by gunfire, and artillery struck without warning. Many who left shelter did not return. As the fighting intensified, the city itself seemed to disintegrate. Familiar landmarks vanished under bombardment. Entire streets disappeared beneath piles of rubble. Fires burned unchecked for days, merging into larger infernos that consumed whole districts. The smell of smoke mixed with that of decay, creating an atmosphere of suffocation and despair. Berlin, once a functioning metropolis, became a landscape of ruins where orientation was difficult and survival uncertain. Soviet troops, hardened by years of war, pressed forward with relentless determination. They adapted quickly to the realities of urban combat, coordinating infantry, armor, and artillery at close range. Assault groups learned to move through buildings rather than streets, to attack from unexpected angles, and to exploit every weakness in the defense. Each captured block brought them closer to the city center and tightened the encirclement. Yet victory came at a high cost. Casualties mounted steadily as defenders fought from prepared positions and from the ruins themselves. Medics worked under constant fire, treating the wounded in shattered entryways and cellars. The wounded were often carried out under cover of darkness, if they could be moved at all. The pace of fighting left little time for rest or reflection. Exhaustion spread through the ranks on both sides. For those inside Berlin, the sense of time dissolved. Days and nights blended together, marked only by changes in the intensity of shelling or the direction of nearby fighting. Official announcements became meaningless, contradicted by the reality visible from shattered windows and cellar doors. Survival became the sole concern. Political slogans and promises of relief lost all relevance in the face of immediate danger. The city burned as the battle raged on. Flames leaped from building to building, and the glow of fires lit the night sky. Smoke drifted through streets and down into shelters, forcing people to move or suffocate. In some areas, the heat was so intense that entire blocks became impassable. Water mains were broken, making firefighting impossible. Destruction fed upon itself, unstoppable and indifferent. In these final days, Berlin was no longer a capital in the conventional sense. It was a battlefield of extreme violence and human suffering. Every building that became a fortress also became a grave. Every street that was defended became a corridor of death. Tanks firing at point-blank range and artillery leveling neighborhoods were not symbols of power, but of the total collapse of restraint. As Soviet forces continued their advance, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The question was not whether the city would fall, but how much of it would survive, and how many lives would be lost before the fighting ended. In cellars beneath burning buildings, civilians waited for the noise to stop. Above them, soldiers fought among ruins that grew larger by the hour. The battle for Berlin had reached its most brutal form, and the city itself was being destroyed in the process. By late April, Soviet armies had completed the encirclement of Berlin. The ring closed methodically, street by street and district by district, until all routes in and out of the city were severed. What had once been a vast and complex urban center was now an isolated pocket of resistance, surrounded on all sides by overwhelming force. Rail lines were cut, roads were under constant fire, and the skies above were dominated by Soviet aircraft. Berlin was no longer a capital connected to a nation. It was a besieged ruin, cut off from the world. Inside the city, the sense of isolation was unmistakable. Supplies dwindled rapidly, and organized movement became nearly impossible. Units that attempted to break out were destroyed or forced back. Any hope of reinforcement had vanished. The defenders were fighting not as part of a coordinated army, but as scattered groups clinging to fragments of territory. The encirclement was complete not only in a physical sense, but in a psychological one. Everyone inside the city understood that there was no escape. Deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler remained sealed inside his bunker. The underground chambers, once intended as a command center, had become a place of confinement. Surrounded by a shrinking circle of aides and loyalists, he was physically protected from artillery fire, but increasingly detached from reality. Reports from the front were filtered, delayed, or ignored. Maps were spread across tables, marked with units that no longer existed or had been destroyed days earlier. Hitler clung to fantasies of salvation. He spoke of armies that would arrive from the north or the south, forces that had already been annihilated or cut off. He placed faith in miracle weapons that were either still experimental or entirely imaginary, believing they could reverse the course of a war that had already been lost. These beliefs were not shared by most of those around him, but few dared to challenge him directly. The bunker became an echo chamber, reinforcing illusion while the world above collapsed. Communication with the outside world steadily disintegrated. Telephone lines were severed by bombardment. Radio contact became sporadic and unreliable. Orders sent out from the bunker often went unanswered, not out of disobedience, but because there was no one left to receive them. Messages from remaining commanders, when they arrived at all, painted a grim picture of exhaustion, collapse, and imminent defeat. Even these reports failed to penetrate fully the wall of denial that had formed around the leadership. Above ground, the city continued to suffer. Soviet artillery pounded the central districts with increasing intensity. Government buildings, symbols of power and authority, were reduced to shattered shells. Fires burned unchecked, and smoke drifted down into streets and cellars. Civilians, soldiers, and officials shared the same ruined spaces, their former roles stripped away by the immediacy of survival. The sounds of battle grew closer to the Reich Chancellery itself, a constant reminder that the front was no longer distant. Within the bunker, time took on a distorted quality. Days blurred together, marked only by brief situation conferences, and the dull thud of explosions overhead. Rations were limited, air was stale, and tension hung over every conversation. Some occupants still spoke of duty and loyalty. Others quietly prepared for the end, making arrangements that acknowledged what could no longer be avoided. The contrast between fantasy and reality grew sharper with each passing hour. Outside, Soviet forces tightened their grip. The encirclement was reinforced, pockets of resistance were reduced, and the remaining defenders were steadily pushed inward. The capture of key bridges, intersections, and government buildings stripped away any remaining illusion of control. The Red Army no longer faced an organized defense, but a collapsing one, fragmented and leaderless. The fall of Berlin was no longer a matter of strategy. It was a matter of time. The reality of defeat could no longer be denied. The promises of final victory, repeated for years, had dissolved into silence. The state that had claimed to be eternal now faced extinction within its own capital. For those trapped inside the city, and for those hidden beneath it, the truth was unavoidable. The war was ending here, in ruin and isolation, with no rescue coming and no future left to imagine. By the final days of April, Berlin stood as a symbol of total collapse. Surrounded, burning, and cut off from the world, it reflected the fate of the regime that had ruled from it. Beneath the shattered streets, the bunker held a leadership clinging to illusion. Above ground, reality advanced relentlessly. The circle had closed, and history was reaching its irreversible conclusion. On April 30th, the final act of the regime unfolded beneath the shattered heart of Berlin. In the underground bunker below the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler ended his life as Soviet forces fought only a short distance away. The man who had ruled Germany for more than a decade, and whose decisions had plunged Europe into catastrophe, chose death rather than capture. His suicide marked not only the personal end of a dictator, but the symbolic collapse of the system built around his authority. News of his death spread unevenly through the bunker and beyond. Among those still gathered underground, reactions were muted, shaped more by exhaustion than shock. Some expressed loyalty even in that moment, others resignation. There was no dramatic transformation of events above ground. Artillery continued to fire, buildings continued to fall, the city continued to burn. Yet something fundamental had changed. The figure around whom all authority had revolved was gone, and with him vanished the last pretense of direction or purpose. In the hours that followed, attempts were made to construct a final political fiction. A successor government was announced, issuing proclamations of continued resistance and orderly transition. These gestures had little effect. Communications were fragmented, commands were ignored or never received, and most defenders were no longer fighting for any leader or ideology. They were fighting, if they fought at all, for survival, habit, or fear of immediate reprisal. On the streets of Berlin, the consequences became visible quickly. Isolated units began to lay down their arms. White flags appeared in windows and on improvised poles. In some sectors, fighting continued briefly, driven by confusion or by commanders who refused to accept reality. In others, resistance collapsed almost at once. The sound of gunfire, once constant, began to ebb in certain areas, replaced by an uneasy, quiet, broken only by distant explosions. For Soviet forces, the fall of organized leadership accelerated the final phase of the battle. Assault groups pushed forward to secure remaining strongpoints, government buildings, and transportation hubs. The objective was no longer to break resistance, but to confirm that it no longer existed. Prisoners were taken in large numbers. Weapons were stacked in courtyards and streets. The Red Army moved with the confidence of an enemy that knew victory was complete. Civilians emerged cautiously from cellars and shelters. Many had spent days or weeks underground, cut off from information and light. They stepped into streets that were barely recognizable, lined with rubble, burned vehicles, and shattered facades. The city smelled of smoke, dust, and decay. For them, the end of fighting did not bring relief so much as numbness. The future was uncertain, and the present was defined by loss. Within days of Hitler's death, organized resistance in Berlin effectively ended. What remained were scattered pockets of armed men, quickly disarmed or persuaded to surrender. The structures of command that had once enforced obedience through terror had disintegrated. No one was left to issue credible orders, and no one believed in victory anymore. The city, battered and exhausted, could no longer sustain even the illusion of defense. On May 2nd, Berlin formally surrendered. The decision acknowledged what had already become evident on the ground. The capital of the Third Reich had fallen. Flags were lowered, weapons were surrendered, and the fighting within the city ceased. The siege that had consumed the final weeks of the war in Germany came to an end, leaving behind ruins and countless dead. The surrender of Berlin did not instantly end the war in Europe, but it made the outcome irreversible. In the days that followed, remaining German forces across the continent laid down their arms. Negotiations moved forward rapidly. Governments collapsed or dissolved. Fronts that had raged for years fell silent one after another. The machinery of war, so long in motion, finally began to stop. When the war in Europe formally concluded shortly afterward, it did so without celebration in the places most affected by its final battles. In Berlin, there was no victory parade, no sense of triumph. There was only devastation and the slow realization of what had been lost. Entire neighborhoods were gone. Families were broken. A generation had been consumed by violence. The death of Adolf Hitler and the surrender of Berlin closed the most destructive chapter in European history. The war ended not with a decisive battlefield flourish, but with exhaustion, ruin, and silence. What remained was the task of reckoning with the consequences. The city that had been the center of power now stood as a warning, its destruction bearing witness to the cost of fanaticism, illusion, and unrestrained war. In the final accounting, the fall of Berlin marked more than a military defeat. It marked the collapse of an idea that had promised dominance and delivered devastation. As the guns fell silent and the smoke slowly cleared, Europe stood at the threshold of a new era, shaped by the memory of what had just ended and by the burden of rebuilding from the ruins it left behind. The Battle of Berlin was the bloodiest urban battle in European history. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians were killed. The city lay in ruins. Germany was defeated, divided, and occupied. The fall of Berlin marked not only the end of the Third Reich, but the beginning of a new era. Europe would be split between East and West.